This is the founding of our nation, is when Te came and, brought us into correct relations with the human and non-human world. And actually one of the symbols on there is water, right? Um, and so, when she made that first covenant with us, she made it in this, not just between humans. The what we call treaty today is called Wo Lakota, which means very many things. It doesn't just mean treaty in kind of the Western legal framework of international law. It also means living in good relations with each other. And what she was trying to do when she introduced Wo Lakota was living in good relations with the plant nations, with the water, the land, and all the animal nations themselves. And so every kind of agreement that we've made, whether it be between us as human nations or non-human nations, always kind of had that original covenant in mind. And so when we think about the water itself, there is, I think there's a tendency to think about, tribal sovereignty within a very kind of strict legal framework. That these are, the winter's rights is what they call them, in water law, in federal Indian water laws, the winter's doctrine. And we have those rights as Lakota, as Dakota people when it comes to the Missouri River. So there's a legal framework, there's a policy framework there. And we've never exerted those winter's rights because when you exert them, you quantify, you put a numerical value on our sovereignty. And I think we've been, very cautious of doing that because our relationship with that water goes beyond just a numerical kind of quantification. So, for example, if we think about the original covenant with Te Sawi, we also have to remember that when we do things, when we enter into agreements or make decisions, that they also impact our non-human relations. So, for example, elk need water to live and drink. The sweetgrass that we use in our ceremonies, the cedar, the berries that still grow on Minnesota, the fish, all of the animal nations and the things that are living require that water to live. And if we solely use the Western legal framework, it only accounts for the human, right? In the Winters Doctrine, it only quantifies consumption based on human consumption and also private industry. That is the priority in Western legal, in the Western law and Western Indian law specifically. And if we're not careful, we could forego those relationships, or we could damage those relationships that we have to the non-human world. And when we think about that, that is one kind of ethical relation. We can talk about the spiritual and the esoteric and those very kind of profound relations. But I think fundamentally, when we talk about just mere survival, we have to acknowledge that every living being, including humans, including the plants, including the animals, needs water to survive. And that's something that we have to keep in mind, especially when it comes to Minnesota. And there's a whole nother gamut of legal frameworks with the treaties, the original, understanding of the treaty laws that we have, both banks, the East and the West Bank. That's what, what encompasses our treaty territory, the East and West Bank of the Missouri River. And that East Bank kind of argument kind of gets lost when we talk about other kind of, other frameworks of Indian water law, because if we have control of that water on the East Bank as well as the West Bank, that means that anything that happens downriver, upriver from us, is going to affect how the decisions that we make with that water. And so there is that kind of relationship. And I would say, there's other kind of like stories that come, that I'm not the one who's the expert or the one who is authorized to tell these stories, but there are other stories like creation stories and origin stories that have to do with Minnesota. But what I'm trying to do in the book is really to lay out what is our actual material relationship. Like everyone, when we say we're defending treaty rights and to protect the water, we don't just mean for us. we understand that there are millions of human beings that aren't all, Lakota or indigenous for that matter, that depend on fresh water, to continue to live on this planet. And so, even though the idea of the notion of a water protector, that's not a solely indigenous identity. There were non-indigenous water protectors. Anybody who walked through the gate of Standing Rock became a water protector, but it was grounded in indigenous values and relations to the land, which I think are incredibly important. And so, there is, I was very cautious in how I wrote certain elements of the book. For one, some of the kind of more esoteric and privileged knowledge isn't I'm not authorized to tell. And so I only wrote what was already published in other writings. And so that was something that an ethical decision that I made, because there are spiritual stories, there are ceremonial stories that have to do with the Minnesota. But what I want, both indigenous and non-indigenous readers to take away is that this is actually a relationship that's grounded in our survival. It's not just some kind of, abstract or mystical thing. It's something that is very real to us. If there's no Missouri River, how do we continue to exist as Lakota people, and how do we continue to exist as human beings?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things I think that really came across in what you just said is that there are very two different ways and perspectives of the river, right? That Western society has a very different view and approach to the river compared to tribal people as well. So one of the things I wanted to ask you as well is, why do you think Indigenous people were well equipped to lead these efforts at Standing Rock?
Well, historically, Standing Rock is a very special place. I believe it was Phyllis Young, who's a Hunkpapa Lakota, old Aimster gangster, American leader in the American Indian movement, who talked about the Hunkpapa's specific role in leading a lot of these efforts to protect the land and protect the river. She calls it, the horn of the buffalo. We are the vanguard of the Lakota nation, to quote her. And she said this to these Dakota Access Pipeliners energy transfer guys who came to the reservation and tried to basically consult with the tribe and get their approval to build the Dakota Access Pipeline. And why I bring up somebody like Phyllis is because Phyllis helped organize Ocheti Shakoi Camp. But also Phyllis was instrumental in 1974 in organizing the first International Indian Treaty Council, which was hosted by Standing Rock. And it was, Dave Archambault, the chairman of Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, in 2016 during the Dakota Access Pipeline protest. His father, Dave Archambault Sr., was one of the original council people in Standing Rock in 1974, who actually issued an invitation to the American Indian movement. At that time, nobody wanted to touch AIM after the Wounded Knee takeover in 1973, and a lot of there was a lot of negativity and bad press attached to the American Indian movement. But one thing that really resonated with a place like Standing Rock, whereas it wasn't so much the case in Pine Ridge, is that there was a synchronicity between the tribal council and what you would call like the traditional kind of treaty council people. And so the treaty council people, the elders, really saw value in what the American Indian movement had to offer. And so they invited them to Standing Rock in 1974 to implement an international program to take the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, our land claims, and just the rights of Indigenous people to the United Nations, and to charge the United States with genocide. And so the birth of the International Indigenous Movement, or one of the many births, it had many origins, but one of the origins was in Standing Rock in 1974. And so in many ways, the framework that we've come to understand as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People originated and were hammered out at that original meeting, that spirit of that particular document. And it took decades. It took 4 decades for them to decide on the language of what does it mean to be an Indigenous person? What are those rights? Um, so in many ways, Standing Rock, I think the Dakota Access, pipeline and the energy transfer partners, the people building the pipeline, the Army Corps of Engineers, the state of North Dakota, underestimated the power of this reservation, and because it wasn't just a reservation, it was one nation among seven nations, the of the Lakota people, and it was Lakota and Dakota people of the Oceti and they knew that they could mobilize the sympathies not only of the Oceti but all Indigenous people and all allied movements. And at this particular time, it's also important to remember in 2016 we had this awful presidential election. It was very hotly contested between Trump and Clinton. There was a lot of disillusion with in the United States, even amongst non-Indigenous people and settler people, around the direction this country was headed, and Trump was kind of set to take the presidency. And after the November 8th, his election in 2016, the numbers at the camps surged because it was the only long-term kind of resistance movement happening. And it's also important to remember that this is the tail end of the Obama administration, right? Vice President Biden, he was in that administration. He's now president right now, so there's a lot of carryover, and also the tribe itself, was in a position to call upon the grassroots movements, to call upon the Treaty Council people, to really bring, that fight, not just in the kind of the courts of the conquer, but also in, the spiritual realm, as well as in the realm of just putting bodies on the line and people on the ground to reclaim space and territory. Because the place where the Oceti camp was actually not on the reservation. It wasn't in Standing Rock, but it was still Oceti treaty land that had been condemned and taken by the Army Corps of Engineers. So in many ways, it represented so many different things, but the Standing Rock Sioux tribe had the moral high ground, and in many ways possessed a kind of wherewithal and foresight that this went beyond just their tribe. That this was an issue for everyone, whether it came down to water rights, whether it came down to climate change. And look at where we are now. We had the cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline for the second time, which is a huge victory. And in 2015, the Obama first canceled the northern leg of the Keystone XL pipeline. And there was an expectation that he would cancel, that he would intervene, or his administration would intervene in the Dakota Access Pipeline, which they did to an extent, but they never really took it off the table the way that they took Keystone XL. And we're in a similar situation right now where we did get Keystone XL taken off, but we're still waiting to see whether or not the Dakota Access Pipeline will be on the chopping block as well. But I do think that credit needs to be, credit is due where for the Standing Rock Sioux tribe for taking on not only the political and legal struggle, but also the cultural and spiritual struggle of what that meant for that particular movement against the Dakota Access Pipeline.